The room was quiet, except for the sound of a sitar. George Harrison lay still, 58 years old, the quiet Beatle finally surrounded by the silence he'd spent a lifetime chasing. Ravi Shankar's fingers moved and the air shimmered with sound that felt like sunlight remembered. "This," George had said, "is the sound I want to die to." When he whispered "love one another," the music carried him home. But rewind to 1970 when George Harrison stood at a crossroads. The Beatles had just imploded, the greatest band in history torn apart by egos, business disputes, and the simple fact that four men who had grown up together in public no longer fit in the same space. John Lennon was launching his solo career with Yoko, making headlines and manifestos. Paul McCartney was already working on his own album, determined to prove he could succeed without the others. Ringo was figuring out his next move, and George, the quiet one, the junior partner, the guitarist who had spent a decade writing songs that couldn't fit on albums because Lennon and McCartney took up all the space, George was about to show the world what happened when you finally gave silence a voice. The dissolution of the Beatles was messy and public, fought through lawyers and the press, each member claiming victimhood and righteousness in equal measure. For George, the breakup felt less like tragedy and more like prison release. He had spent years feeling stifled, his contributions minimized, his spiritual evolution mocked by bandmates who saw his Indian obsessions as phase rather than transformation. John had called him the odd one out. Paul had patronized him in the studio, redoing his guitar parts without permission. Even Ringo, the diplomatic one, had sometimes sided with John and Paul when George suggested changes, but the wounds went deeper than professional slights. George had watched the Beatles become a machine that consumed everything it touched, their creativity, their friendships, their sense of self. They had started as four working-class kids from Liverpool who loved music, and they had ended as corporate entities, brands, symbols that bore little resemblance to the people trapped inside them. The Beatles saved the world from post-war dreariness, gave a generation hope and joy and a soundtrack for social change. But who was going to save the Beatles from being the Beatles? George had asked this question for years, and the answer that came back was always the same. No one. You couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, couldn't free someone who had grown comfortable in their cage. John was addicted to controversy, Paul to control, Ringo to keeping the peace at any cost, and George was addicted to seeking, to the belief that somewhere beyond the fame and fortune and screaming crowds, there was truth waiting to be discovered. The band's collapse gave him permission to pursue that truth without compromise or apology. The release of All Things Must Pass in November 1970 wasn't just an album. It was a statement, a triple album that said everything George had been holding back for years. Critics were stunned. How had the quiet Beatle been sitting on this much brilliance? The answer was simple and complicated. He had always been this good, but no one had been listening closely enough. In the Beatles, George was the sky, vast, necessary, but easy to overlook when you were focused on the fire and the heart. Now, finally, the sky was speaking, and its voice was bigger than anyone had imagined. This is the story of a man who saved the world with music, then spent the rest of his life trying to save himself from the success that came with it. A man who brought Eastern spirituality to Western pop culture not as fashion but as faith, who organized the first charity concert in rock history, who planted gardens while others built empires, who understood that everything must pass, including fame, fortune, and life itself, and found peace in that impermanence. George Harrison didn't want to be remembered as a Beatle. He wanted to be remembered as someone who tried to go home to God. And the question that haunts his legacy is this: did he make it? Liverpool, England, February 25, 1943. George Harrison was born into a working-class family in a city being bombed by the Luftwaffe, where survival meant keeping your head down and your expectations modest. His father was a bus driver, his mother a shop assistant. There were 3 older siblings, and George, the baby, learned early that being youngest meant being quietest, that the way to survive in a crowded house was to observe rather than demand. Born under bombs, he learned early that peace was not default, it had to be made. The Liverpool of George's childhood was gray, literally and metaphorically. Post-war Britain was rationed, austere, rebuilding. Entertainment was scarce and precious. When rock and roll arrived from America in the mid-1950s, Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, it hit British teenagers like revelation. Here was energy, rebellion, sex, life, everything their bombed-out city and exhausted country wasn't providing. George heard it and felt something fundamental shift. Music wasn't just sound, it was escape, possibility, a way out of the predetermined path from school to factory to grave. At 13, he bought his first guitar with money he'd saved from a paper route. His mother, Louise, encouraged him despite his father's skepticism about music as career. She recognized in George something she couldn't name but trusted, a seriousness, a focus, a sense that this wasn't hobby but calling. He practiced obsessively, his fingers bleeding from the strings, learning not just how to play but how to make the guitar speak emotions he couldn't articulate verbally. George was never the most technically gifted guitarist. Eric Clapton had more flash, Jeff Beck more innovation. But George had something else: taste, restraint, the ability to play what the song needed rather than what would show off his skill. Even as a teenager, he understood that the best guitar work was often the least showy. At 15, George met Paul McCartney on the school bus. Paul, a year older and already confident in ways George wasn't, had a band with John Lennon. They needed a guitarist. Paul vouched for George, brought him to audition. John was skeptical. George was too young, too quiet, too much a kid. But then George played and John heard something he couldn't dismiss. Competence, reliability, and beneath the shyness, a quiet confidence that suggested depths. George joined what would become the Beatles, but always as the junior member. John and Paul were the leaders, the songwriters, the yin and yang of the band's creative core. George was the guitarist, important but secondary, the one who made their songs better but rarely got to contribute his own. For years, this arrangement worked. The Beatles became huge, then massive, then a cultural phenomenon beyond anything music had seen before. And George, dutiful and professional, played his parts, added his harmonies, stood slightly behind John and Paul in photographs, and accepted his role. He was the sky, vast, necessary, but easy to overlook when you were focused on the fire and the heart. And when the fire burned out, only the sky remained. But acceptance breeds resentment when it's not chosen, when it's imposed. By the mid-1960s, George was writing songs that were as good as many of the Lennon-McCartney compositions. But the Beatles' albums had limited space, and John and Paul's songs filled it. George was allowed 1 or 2 tracks per album if he was lucky, often relegated to the weakest positions. His suggestions were dismissed, his ideas overlooked. He was the quiet one, not by nature but by necessity, silenced by the brilliance of his bandmates. The frustration built slowly, like water behind a dam. George never exploded, that wasn't his style. Instead, he withdrew, sought meaning elsewhere, and in that seeking he found something that would change not just his life but the trajectory of popular music. India. In 1965, during the filming of Help, George encountered the sitar, an Indian classical instrument that sounded unlike anything in Western music. He was immediately fascinated, not just by the sound but by what it represented, a completely different musical tradition with different rules, different goals, different assumptions about what music was for. Western music was about entertainment, performance, individual expression. Indian classical music was about spiritual practice, about using sound to access higher consciousness, about dissolving the ego rather than celebrating it. In a world chasing applause, George began chasing silence. George began studying the sitar with Ravi Shankar, one of the instrument's greatest masters. Shankar was initially skeptical. Western musicians typically wanted to appropriate Indian sounds without understanding their context. But he recognized in George genuine hunger for knowledge, respect for the tradition, willingness to be a student rather than a star. Their relationship became one of the most important in George's life, transcending music to become spiritual mentorship. He didn't master the sitar, he let it master him. Through Shankar, George was introduced to Indian philosophy, Hinduism, meditation. The concept that material success was ultimately hollow, that the soul's journey toward union with the divine was life's true purpose. For someone who had achieved everything the material world promised, fame, wealth, adoration, and found it insufficient, this philosophy was revelation. The Beatles had saved the world through music, but who was going to save the Beatles from the burden of being the Beatles? George began to think maybe the answer wasn't in the West at all. The teachings resonated because they addressed questions George had been asking since adolescence, but couldn't articulate until finding this framework. Why did success feel hollow? Why did achievement never satisfy? Why did each new milestone, another hit record, another sold-out stadium, another magazine cover, leave him feeling more empty rather than more fulfilled? The Indian spiritual tradition had answers. Because you're seeking permanence in impermanent things. Because you're trying to fill a spiritual void with material accomplishments, because the ego can never be satisfied no matter how much you feed it. George threw himself into study with characteristic intensity. He read the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, commentaries by various gurus and teachers. He practiced meditation for hours daily, sitting still while his body screamed at him to move, learning to observe thoughts without attachment. Discovering that beneath the constant mental chatter was something quieter, deeper, more real than the George Harrison the world knew. He experimented with chanting, with yoga, with vegetarianism, with all the practices that promised to bring him closer to the divine. His bandmates watched this transformation with mixture of bemusement and concern. John, cynical about all institutions, including religious ones, mocked George's devotion as naivety, saw the gurus as con artists exploiting George's wealth and fame. Paul, pragmatic and earthbound, couldn't understand why George would want to transcend material reality when material reality had been so generous to them. Ringo, as always, tried to be supportive while not really comprehending what George was searching for. But George didn't need their understanding. For the first time in his life, he had found something that was his alone, not shared with the band, not subject to group consensus, not diluted by compromise. His spirituality became the core of his identity in ways that music never quite had. Music was what he did, spirituality was who he was, or at least who he was trying to become. In 1968, the Beatles traveled to Rishikesh, India to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. For George, the trip was transformative. While John grew disillusioned with the Maharishi and Paul treated it as interesting experience, George took the teachings seriously, incorporated them into his worldview, began to see his life and career through a spiritual lens. Music wasn't just what he did, it was his path to God, his yoga, his offering. Every note became prayer, every song an attempt at transcendence. But this spiritual awakening made the mundane conflicts of the Beatles feel increasingly unbearable. The petty arguments about song credits, the business disputes with Apple Corps, the tension between John and Paul, the sense that they were all trapped in a machine of their own creation. It all felt so small compared to the questions George was asking. Who am I beyond this identity? What is the purpose of existence? How do I serve the divine? By 1969, the Beatles were fracturing. The famous rooftop concert felt less like celebration and more like last gasp. George famously quit the band briefly during the Let It Be sessions, unable to tolerate Paul's controlling behavior and John's disengagement. He came back, but something had broken. When the band officially dissolved in 1970, George felt not grief but relief. He was finally free to make music on his terms, to say everything he'd been holding back. All Things Must Pass, released in November 1970, was George's statement of independence. A triple album packed with songs he'd written over the previous years but couldn't release through the Beatles. It was sprawling, ambitious, uncompromising. The production, courtesy of Phil Spector, was massive. Walls of sound, layers of guitars, gospel choirs, orchestras. George's voice, which had always been relegated to occasional lead vocals in the Beatles, was now front and center, raw and earnest and unafraid. The album's creation was cathartic for George in ways that went beyond music. Every song was a piece of himself he'd been forced to suppress, every lyric an expression of feelings he'd learned to hide. Working with Spector, who understood that George needed not just to record these songs but to purge them, the sessions became almost therapeutic. George would sometimes break down in the studio, overwhelmed by finally being able to say everything he'd held back for years. The musicians George assembled for the album were a testament to the respect he'd earned despite his years in shadow. Eric Clapton, already one of rock's guitar gods, played on multiple tracks and co-wrote one of the standouts. Ringo provided drums, the one Beatle who maintained genuine friendship with George through the breakup. Billy Preston brought his gospel-infused keyboard work. Dave Mason, Gary Wright, countless other talented musicians showed up not for the paycheck, but because they wanted to be part of whatever George was creating. The recording sessions had a spiritual dimension that was unusual for rock albums. George insisted on starting each day with meditation, gathering the musicians in silence before picking up instruments. He talked about the songs not as commercial products but as prayers, offerings, attempts to use sound to access something beyond words. Some musicians found this pretentious. Others recognized it as George's authentic attempt to bridge his two passions, music and spirituality, into unified practice. The lead single encapsulated everything George had become. The song was both pop perfection, catchy, radio-friendly, accessible, and spiritual devotion, a mantra disguised as a love song, blurring the line between romantic and divine love. It shot to #1 worldwide, proving that audiences were hungry for music that acknowledged something beyond the material, that spoke to the soul's yearning for connection with the infinite. But the song's success came with complications George hadn't anticipated. It was later revealed to have melodic similarities to another composition, leading to a plagiarism lawsuit that would haunt George for years. He maintained he hadn't consciously copied anything, that melodies exist in the ether and sometimes different people access the same patterns. The court disagreed, ruling against him in a decision that devastated George. Not because of the money, but because it suggested his most spiritual, most heartfelt creation was somehow fraudulent, stolen rather than channeled. The lawsuit became a metaphor for George's struggle with success. He wanted to create music that served God, that helped people transcend material concerns. But the music existed in the material world, subject to copyright law and commercial exploitation and legal disputes. You couldn't escape the material realm even when creating art explicitly about transcending it. The contradiction ate at George, reinforcing his growing belief that the music industry was incompatible with spiritual practice, that he would have to choose between them. Critics hailed the album as a masterpiece. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who everyone had underestimated, had just released one of the greatest debut solo albums in rock history. He had stepped out of John and Paul's shadow and proven he didn't need them to make transcendent music. The question now was, what do you do when you finally get everything you've been denied? For George, success was complicated. He had always claimed he didn't care about fame, that he was doing music for spiritual reasons rather than commercial ones. But the massive success of All Things Must Pass forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He did care. He was proud, vindicated, satisfied to finally receive recognition commensurate with his talent. And that pride troubled him because his spiritual teachings emphasized ego dissolution, detachment from outcomes, indifference to worldly success. How could he reconcile his human satisfaction with his spiritual aspirations? He wanted to dissolve himself into God, but he kept checking if the record chart approved. This tension would define the rest of George's life. The gap between who he wanted to be, a humble seeker, detached from material concerns, and who he actually was, a man who had worked incredibly hard for success and couldn't help but enjoy it when it came. He was honest about this contradiction in ways that made him more relatable than his loftier statements suggested. He wanted to be enlightened, but he was also still George from Liverpool who liked nice guitars and fast cars. A millionaire preaching detachment, a saint who still loved Ferraris. In August 1971, George organized the Concert for Bangladesh, a charity show at Madison Square Garden to raise money for refugees from the Bangladesh Liberation War. It was unprecedented. Rock stars didn't do charity concerts, didn't use their platform for humanitarian causes. But George, moved by his friend Ravi Shankar's pleas for help, assembled an all-star lineup including Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and others for 2 shows that raised awareness and millions of dollars. The concert was important not just for what it achieved, but for what it represented. The idea that musicians had responsibility beyond entertainment, that fame could be leveraged for good, that rock and roll could be a force for positive change. Every charity concert that followed, Live Aid, Farm Aid, countless benefits, traces its lineage back to George's decision to use his post-Beatles platform for something meaningful. Standing on stage at Madison Square Garden wearing a white kurta, leading 40,000 people through spiritual chants, George experienced something profound. This was what he'd been seeking: music as service, as offering, as bridge between human and divine. For those hours, the concert transcended performance to become ritual, communion, prayer made sound. It was the closest George would come to merging his artistic and spiritual ambitions into unified whole. For one night, Madison Square Garden became a temple, but the aftermath was messy. The money didn't reach refugees as quickly as promised. There were accusations of mismanagement, questions about where the funds went, lawsuits that dragged on for years. George, who had organized the concert with pure intentions, found himself dealing with lawyers, accountants, bureaucrats, all the machinery of the material world he'd tried to transcend. It was exhausting and disillusioning, a reminder that even good intentions get corrupted by systems. The 1970s were difficult for George in ways that success couldn't solve and spirituality couldn't fully ameliorate. His marriage to Pattie Boyd, already strained by his spiritual obsessions and long absences, collapsed when she began an affair with Eric Clapton, George's close friend. The betrayal was devastating, not just losing his wife, but losing her to someone he trusted, someone who had played on his albums, someone who knew him intimately. George's response to this betrayal revealed both his spiritual aspirations and his human limitations. Publicly, he forgave them, even remained friends with Eric, said things like, "Love doesn't end just because people change places." It was magnanimous, enlightened, the kind of response his spiritual practice demanded. But privately, friends said he was crushed, angry, struggling to reconcile his pain with his professed detachment. The divorce dragged on bitterly, money and property and hurt feelings tangling into legal warfare that contradicted every spiritual principle he claimed to embody. His subsequent albums throughout the 70s had moments of brilliance but lacked the cohesion and urgency of All Things Must Pass. George seemed to be coasting, more interested in his film production company, Handmade Films, which financed Monty Python's Life of Brian and other projects, than in making music. He retreated to his estate, Friar Park, a massive Victorian Gothic mansion with elaborate gardens that he obsessively tended. While John Lennon was making headlines with activism, and Paul McCartney was churning out hit albums, George was planting trees and roses, finding in gardening the peace that fame couldn't provide. While the world built monuments, George planted forgiveness. Friends from this period described George as increasingly reclusive, disillusioned with the music industry, more interested in silence than sound. He had glimpsed enlightenment and found it incompatible with celebrity. The spotlight burned, the garden healed. He spoke about death not with fear but with longing, as if it represented release from the burden of being George Harrison, as if dying would finally allow him to merge with the divine he'd spent his life seeking. He stopped performing for crowds and started performing for creation itself. In December 1999, George experienced another form of violence when a mentally ill man broke into Friar Park and attacked him with a knife. George, at 56, fought back alongside his wife Olivia, sustaining serious injuries that required surgery and long recovery. The attack shattered his sense of security, his belief that spiritual practice and good intentions could protect him from worldly harm. He had spent decades cultivating non-attachment, and suddenly his attachment to life, to his body, to his wife Olivia, who fought off the attacker, became undeniable. The invasion was traumatic in ways George struggled to process. Friar Park had been his sanctuary, the one place where he could escape public scrutiny and cultivate the peace his spiritual practice required. The gardens he'd spent years perfecting, the rooms filled with instruments and art, the meditation spaces he'd created, all of it had been violated by violence. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological damage lingered. George became more reclusive, more paranoid, more aware of his own mortality. The attack also forced George to confront uncomfortable truths about fame's permanence. He hadn't been a Beatle in decades, hadn't sought spotlight in years, had done everything possible to live quietly and privately. But to the mentally ill man who attacked him, George was still a celebrity, still a symbol, still a target. You couldn't retire from fame, couldn't undo having been famous, couldn't escape the consequences of having once been one of the most recognizable faces on earth. The past followed you, shaped how people saw you, sometimes endangered you decades later. Friends noticed changes in George after the attack. The man who had preached nonviolence, who had spent his life seeking peace, now installed extensive security systems and became hypervigilant about strangers. The contradiction troubled him. How could he claim to be detached from material concerns while simultaneously protecting his material possessions and physical safety? How could he preach love and forgiveness while feeling rage toward his attacker? Once again, spiritual philosophy provided framework but not solution, explanation but not comfort. The attack also exacerbated health problems George had been quietly battling. He had survived throat cancer in 1997, attributing it to decades of smoking, a habit he'd picked up as a teenager and never fully quit despite knowing its dangers. The cancer had been treated successfully, and George had taken it as warning, opportunity to reform his lifestyle and practices. But the stress of the attack, the physical trauma, the psychological toll, it all weakened his already compromised system. His final album, Brainwashed, was recorded while he was dying, literally racing against his body's deterioration to complete it. His son Donnie and longtime producer Jeff Lynne finished it after George's death, but the songs were all his. Meditations on mortality, impermanence, The Soul's Journey Beyond the Body. The title track included lyrics that could serve as his epitaph, acknowledging how thoroughly culture conditions us, how difficult it is to see clearly when every message is designed to obscure truth. In November 2001, George was moved to a friend's home in Los Angeles, his condition deteriorating rapidly. He knew he was dying and approached it with the same curiosity he brought to living. He wasn't afraid, or if he was, he didn't show it. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment, believing death was just where the light changes, that consciousness doesn't end, but transforms. Now he would find out if his faith was justified. Ravi Shankar came to play for him. Shankar, who had been more than teacher, brother, friend, guide, sat beside George's bed and played the sitar one final time. The music filled the room, those ancient ragas that George had first heard 36 years earlier and followed like a map to some destination he could sense but never quite reach in life. George listened, smiled, let the sound carry him away from pain, from his body, from George Harrison, the person toward whatever lay beyond. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died, surrounded by family, friends, and the music that had defined his life. He was 58 years old, the first Beatle to die of natural causes. The world mourned, but the mourning felt different than it would for John Lennon's violent death or would later for the others. George's death felt ordained, timely, as if he had completed his work and was ready to move on. His last words, "Love one another," were so perfectly George, simple, direct, essential, stripping away all complexity to reveal the core truth he'd spent his life learning. His body was cremated, and as specified in his will, his ashes were scattered in the Ganges River in India, returning him to the spiritual home he'd found so far from Liverpool. Friends and family gathered in both Los Angeles and India, celebrating his life with music, chanting, and tears that felt less like grief and more like recognition that something precious had passed from the world. The obituaries were respectful, noting his musical achievements, his spiritual seeking, his quiet dignity. But many missed what made George genuinely important. He had shown an entire generation that there were alternatives to the materialism and ego worship that defined Western culture. He had brought Eastern philosophy to Western pop music not as gimmick but as genuine practice, had modeled what it looked like to achieve everything and still seek something more, had demonstrated that the quiet voice often has the most to say. George Harrison's legacy is complicated and beautiful. Musically, he was responsible for some of the most enduring songs in popular music. Compositions that blend technical skill with emotional depth, that sound simple but reveal complexity upon repeated listening. His guitar work on Beatles records is a masterclass in taste and restraint, in knowing when to play and when to let silence speak. His solo work, particularly All Things Must Pass, stands alongside the best albums of the rock era, but George's cultural impact extends beyond music. He legitimized spiritual seeking in rock and roll, opened doors for countless artists who wanted their work to address existential questions without apology. He showed that you could be wildly successful and still feel incomplete, that fame and fortune don't answer life's deepest questions, that sometimes the search for meaning requires walking away from everything the world says you should want. The concert for Bangladesh established a template for celebrity activism that continues today. George proved that musicians could use their platform for humanitarian causes, that concerts could be both entertainment and service, that rock stars had responsibility beyond their record sales. Every benefit concert since owes him a debt. Perhaps most importantly, George lived and died demonstrating that impermanence isn't tragedy. It's truth. Everything must pass. Success, failure, fame, obscurity, love, loss, life itself. The question isn't whether things will end, but how we respond to that inevitable ending. George responded with grace, humor, music, and an unwavering belief that beneath the material world's constant change, something unchanging and divine persisted. Did George Harrison achieve enlightenment? Did he find the God he spent his life seeking? We'll never know. And George would probably laugh at the question, reminding us that seeking is more important than finding, that the journey is the destination. What we do know is that he tried, honestly and publicly, to live according to spiritual principles in a world designed to reward the opposite. He failed sometimes, succeeded sometimes, and always remained honest about the difficulty of walking a spiritual path while maintaining a human life. He didn't find God in the sky. He found him between the notes. His music remains perpetually present tense, always arriving like the sun. Every time someone discovers his songs, George's voice and guitar come alive again, offering the same message he spent his life trying to articulate. Beneath all the noise and drama and material concerns, something simple and true persists. Love one another. Seek truth. Recognize that everything must pass, including you, and find peace in that recognition rather than fear. The quiet Beatle found his voice by leaving the noise behind, found his truth by admitting he didn't have all the answers, found his legacy by insisting there were more important things than legacy. He wanted to go home to God, and maybe he did. But the music he left behind suggests he found something even more valuable. The understanding that home isn't a destination but a state of being, not a place you arrive at, but a recognition of where you've always been. George Harrison didn't escape the world, he tuned it, and the chord is still ringing. If music can lead us to God, why do we spend so much time chasing applause instead of silence? And when the quietest voice in the room says love one another, why does it still sound louder than everything else?